Before we begin, we'd like to recognize the ancestral stewards of these lands. Because we're all from unique geographic locations, we invite you to open the native land map that we'll link in the chat. You can enter your location and take a moment to acknowledge the communities deeply connected to the unceded land where you live. Know that this map is not perfect, it is eternally incomplete and may leave out or misrepresent the fullness of Indigenous peoples and their histories. Though many of these Native nations were forcefully removed from their traditional territory, these lands continue to carry the stories of these diverse peoples and their struggles for survival and identity. As agroforesters, we feel we have an obligation and a responsibility to recognize, elevate, and support Indigenous peoples and publicly acknowledge their foundational contributions to the life of the spaces where we work and live. So tonight, for our nutshell conversation, we are pleased to welcome Gary Bentrup and Gail Nordheim. Gary Bentrup is the Research Landscape Planner for the USDA National Agroforestry Center, and one aspect of his research is agroforestry's potential role in adapting to climate change and extreme weather events, and the theory and principles for effective science delivery. Gail Nordheim is president of the 350 Madison Board of Directors and a graduate of the Climate Reality Leadership Program. She's a longtime Madison resident whose career has included positions in state and local government and management consulting. We'll share links to both the National Agroforestry Center and 350 Madison in the chat window if you want to learn more about each of those organizations. Gary and Gail will each share about their work in the first half hour, and then they'll each exchange questions to start this nutshell conversation. You're welcome to post questions for either or both of them in the chat window at any time, and we'll come back around to those in the second half of the hour. So with that, I think we've covered the context here. And Gary, when you're ready, you can begin.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and thank you everybody for attending tonight. I really like to extend my appreciation to the Savannah Institute and the Center for Agroforestry for hosting this nutshell conversation. It's a great series, and I'm glad to be a part of it. To kind of start off this presentation, as it was acknowledged earlier, I want to speak to a land acknowledgement. I'm based in Lincoln, Nebraska. And there were 3 tribes that steward these lands, kind of at a crossroads here, the Pawnee, the Sioux, and the Oto. And working at the National Agroforestry Center, which has recognizing that agroforestry has deep roots in Indigenous knowledge, we're trying to kind of really build on land acknowledgements and really work toward more reconciliation and Indigenous allyship. And really trying to be more intentional in our efforts as we continue to move forward and learn. So I don't really want to speak to climate change itself, as we're all pretty familiar with that. I just put this slide up here just as a reminder that climate change is not a monolithic factor. It's going to have impacts on regions very different across the United States and across the world. And likewise, it's going to also have impacts on various populations within those regions differently. And so bringing that awareness as we look for climate solutions. And so at the National Agroforestry Center, we look at climate change through the lens of agroforestry as one tool for addressing climate change. And just to provide a little background, agroforestry simply is the integration of trees and shrubs and other woody perennials in agricultural systems to provide both production benefits as well as land stewardship benefits. And there's different categories of agroforestry practices, from alley cropping to silvopasture. I won't go into the specific different practices in this presentation per se. And just looking across the landscape, the national view, we have over 30,000 farms that have at least one agroforestry practice based on the 2017 census. But one thing I want to bring forward is that thinking that we may be missing a bit, thinking of agroforestry on tribal or federal lands or other public lands, as well as maybe missing agroforestry that doesn't fit into these 5 categories. And just kind of putting that out there as something that we can maybe work toward better answering. So a couple years ago, the U.S. Forest Service, with many partners from across the United States, over 50 scientists and other resource professionals, gathered together to work on scientific assessment of agroforestry and its role in climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And here's just kind of a summary of the chapters in this report. And it looked at both adaptation services and mitigation services. It also looked at the human dimensions of agroforestry in this role and really looked again back toward indigenous knowledge and recognizing that what's not all in scientific literature does not capture all the wisdom and knowledge that's out there. There is much wisdom for climate change adaptation that we can learn from. And this report is available free. You can go to the National Agroforestry Center's website and download it. And so kind of providing a little bit of a summary from this report, agroforestry provides a number of adaptation services. And these are really the reasons agroforestry kind of goes in the first place. Agroforestry, by the nature of adding woody plants into agricultural landscapes, increases that structural and functional diversity. And this influences things such as ecosystem services, microclimate, species migration, and all these factors can work together in kind of managing or helping adapt to some of the extreme weather events that we have, the increasing temperatures. So things such as helping to reduce livestock stress and enhance animal well-being are some of the features that agroforestry can play a role in. There's also kind of opportunities to assist with plant species migration through planting decisions, with choosing our plant material carefully, as well as also providing some biodiversity benefits, such as travel corridors for species migration. I'm not really going to speak tonight so much on the mitigation side of things, but just to say that agroforestry has real opportunities to sequester carbon and reduce other greenhouse gases. That mitigation role is also particularly important because one of the opportunities with agroforestry is that it's one tool of many that can be able to both provide adaptation services as well as mitigation services. And so when we think about resilient landscapes, one of the reasons agroforestry provides resilient landscapes is that risk management is really difficult in simple monoculture systems. And these 2 pictures, I think, really bring that point home. Here we have a flooded corn system that's wiped out for that year, where below we have a alley cropping system with willows, where even though the annual crop was lost between the rows of willows, the willows still provided a crop, as well as water quality benefits that would not be found in these other monoculture systems. And again, when we look at that diversity of ecosystem services, it gives us an opportunity to diversify and provide more services than just kind of optimizing, say, for one service, such as crop production. I'm not going to go into specific research findings out of the different studies that we synthesized. There's just an example on the side. But there is good scientific evidence supporting how these can have real tangible benefits on the landscape. I'd be amiss if we didn't talk about, though, climate change is also going to have impact on agroforestry. And some of the ways that it's going to negatively impact it is through the different changes in increasing in frequency of flood events. This translates into reduced growth rate and increased mortality, also increases some indirect effects, such as susceptibility to pest and disease issues. We may also have issues with winter chilling requirements for different fruit, stone crops, and so forth. So it's not, I don't want to come across as agroforestry being a solution without any of its own challenges. I'd like to now kind of shift and just move to some quick little mini case studies. I feel these kind of offer a little bit more of a tangible uh, uh, frame to look at this than kind of talking more in the abstract. The first one that many of you might be aware of is the Prairie State's Forestry project. This was initiated during the Dust Bowl era and was done by the US Forest Service, and it established shelter belts across the central part of the United States from basically the Canadian border down to northern Texas. And this was implemented on over 30,000 farms, and over 18,000 miles of windbreaks were planted. And these windbreaks are still found in many of these places. For example, in Antelope County, over 40% of these windbreaks are still fully intact. I think there's a tendency these days to think of windbreaks as maybe an outdated technology. We can solve our soil erosion issues with cover crops and no-till, but the evidence doesn't suggest that. We still have significant wind erosion events that not only cause loss of productivity, but are public safety issues. There was an accident just 2 years ago, just outside of Lincoln, that resulted in fatalities. And with climate change, wind erosion is expected to increase. And also a concerning is that when we look at the one map below showing areas that have been broken out of perennial grassland cover into row crop, and from 2008 to 2012, the size of an area the size of New Hampshire has been opened up. Moving to the southeast, I'd like to talk a little bit about silvopasture. The number of heat days over 95 degrees in the southeast are predicted to increase dramatically. And silvopasture provides an opportunity to help kind of mitigate this, to maintain livestock productivity and well-being. Shading increases forage quality by increasing protein content while reducing fiber. And shading also helps livestock reach their weight gain quicker. It also allows for some balancing of short and long-term income sources from both the livestock to the tree crop. Another kind of issue that we're facing under climate change is cold water fisheries, which have an important role in many indigenous cultures, as well as just food source and recreational. And we're expected to have a 62% decline by the year 2100. And riparian forest buffers can provide shade on the water surface, which can been shown to reduce water temperatures fairly significantly, enough that we might be able to maintain some of these cold water fisheries. As an example, the Tucannon River in the state of Washington was really suffering from significant losses in the Chinook salmon runs. In the mid-90s, only 54 salmon were returning to spawn, and there were no juveniles found in the Tucannon River. Through the state of Washington CREP program, over 1,100 acres of riparian forest buffers were implemented, along with other measures. And over the last kind of 20 years, this Chinook salmon have rebounded to almost 1,800. There's still a long ways to go to creating a really viable fisheries, but we are making headways, and agroforestry can be one tool. And to kind of wrap it up, thinking about, again, the title of this webinar, and climate resilience and justice. And, you know, looking at examples that are occurring across the United States, some that we're involved with, some we're not, but there are real opportunities to build that linkage. And some examples is out in California, the Karuk and York tribes are now working with US Forest Service managers on National Forest Service lands where they've had traditional agroforestry systems on these landscapes that used prescribed burning to maintain their traditional foods, herbs, and medicines. At the Northern Great Lakes Visitor Center in Ashland, Wisconsin, a windbreak was planted using local culturally significant plants to kind of highlight these indigenous plant materials to bring a little more awareness. And two final examples is the Koikali Valley Comprehensive Family Services has a 100-acre basically food forest on the island of Hawaii where they're using very old traditional indigenous agroforestry approaches to managing several layers of the forest. And in the Blackfeet Community College in Browning, Montana, they are working on a project where they're going to be doing a riparian buffer, again, with culturally significant plants for the Blackfeet Reservation. And just finally, there's some resources that may be of interest for folks at the USDA National Agroforestry's website. Things such as tech notes. We have a webinar library with lots of different webinars on agroforestry that's searchable, and some other tools. So you can check it out at your leisure. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gary. Gail, when you are ready, we can get started. And just as a reminder, please feel free to keep typing questions in that chat box as you think of them during these presentations.
Okay, well, thank you, Gary. Your presentation was really interesting. Thank you for doing that, and thank you to Savannah Institute for having me here today. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to start tonight. I'm with a group called 350 Madison, and I'm going to start by spending just a few minutes talking about what we do and our approach to fighting climate change. And then I'm going to focus on a new report and recommendations from the governor's climate task force in Wisconsin. And I think it'll be an interesting juxtaposition with some of the kinds of things that Gary was talking about, some of their recommendations. So just to get started, 350 Madison is a nonprofit. We were formed in 2012. We're a grassroots group. We're part of the national and international 350.org network. And I think our mission statement encapsulates what we do. We mobilize people to take action on climate change and demand a rapid transition to a just and sustainable world powered by clean, renewable energy. Through our campaigns, we oppose pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure. We work with local governments to convert society to clean, renewable energy, and we pressure large financial institutions to stop financing fossil fuel companies and promote changes for a healthy, sustainable environment. We have 4 campaigns. Our tar sands campaign resists oil pipelines in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. We are particularly engaged right now in resisting 2 pipelines, one of which goes across northern Wisconsin and under the Mackinac Straits and into Michigan, and it puts the Lake Superior watershed in Wisconsin and the Great Lakes at great risk. The other one is being built in Minnesota right now. It will ultimately have an extension through Wisconsin in all likelihood, and it transports the very dangerous tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, which is extremely toxic and dangerous. Our Divest and Defund team pressures financial institutions to divest from fossil fuels. And the focus of that team at this time is we're part of a national campaign to get Chase Bank, JP Morgan Chase, to divest from fossil fuels. They have put a tremendous amount of money into the fossil fuel industry, and they are by far the largest lender for fossil fuels in the United States. And so we are engaged in a campaign to pressure them to divest, and it is beginning to show some results. Our Community Climate Solutions team works with local communities in our area to encourage them and support them in moving towards renewable energy and climate-friendly policies. And this team is also now going to be focusing on our state government, and I'll be talking more about that later. And then finally, our climate justice team keeps us looking at issues of climate and racial justice, and works to establish ties with underrepresented groups in our communities, and also make sure that we are welcoming and open to diversity in how, and that we're aware of climate justice in our work. So in 2014, the International Panel on Climate Change report said, there may be a threshold of global warming beyond which current agricultural practices can no longer support large human civilizations. And I'm sure everyone in this audience is very aware of this and aware of the depth and urgency of the crisis. The good news, of course, is that we're about to get a new administration that is prioritizing climate change nationwide. And some states are there's a wide variety, but states are getting active in this area too. And I'm going to talk today about Wisconsin, because that's where I'm from. And I realize that many people in this audience aren't from Wisconsin, but I think you will find some of their recommendations interesting, and I would really be very interested in your feedback on them in terms of whether these represent good policy. So this report just recently came out. There was a governor's task force on climate change, which worked for well over a year. It was chaired by our lieutenant governor with 31 members with diverse backgrounds. And their report came out last month with 55 recommendations for what state government should be doing to address climate change. And 9 of those recommendations were about either food systems or forestry. And the little code that you see there, the little circles indicate whether the recommendation could be carried out by executive action, whether it would require appropriation of money, or whether it could just be done by legislation.
Hi, Gail. Sorry to interrupt. Are you sharing your screen? Because we
Oh
don't.
my gosh. Yeah, I am. You're
see
not
the
seeing
screen.
it? You're not
Yeah,
seeing
I
it?
can't. Nope, we don't. So you might want to hit that green screen share button again.
Okay. Let me get out of this. Okay, are you seeing it now?
Yep, we can see it now.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry we didn't catch that sooner.
Okay, well, I'll just really quickly take you through. This is our vision and mission. These are our campaigns. This is what the International Panel on Climate Change said. Here's the report cover. This is the information about the report and the task force. And then this is where we were. These are the recommendations from the report about food systems and forestry. And I'm going to quickly take you through these. And I think some of them sounded very relevant to some of the things Gary was talking about, some aren't. But I think questions to think about as a group that's very knowledgeable in this area is, do you think these are the right set of recommendations? Which do you think are most, would have the biggest impact? I'd really be very interested in getting your feedback on that. So the first recommendation is increase funding to support local food systems. So there are some existing programs, Farm to School and Buy Local, Buy Wisconsin. They're saying increase funding for that. There's a proposed new program called Governor's Farm to Fork. They say fund that, and then support programs that promote local food system development. And the report, of course, goes into much more detail about it, but this is a high-level summary of what they're recommending. Then the next recommendation is to develop a food waste program. And what they're suggesting, apparently there's a successful program in Nashville, Tennessee. They suggest a pilot for Wisconsin, modeled after that Nashville program that would prevent food waste, redirect surplus foods, emphasize composting. It would have a special emphasis on food deserts, and it would work with restaurants, farmers, grocery stores, and local communities. I found it really interesting in Gary's talk to see the agroforestry work being done in northern Wisconsin, because some of these recommendations also deal with that. Wild rice is a very important crop in northern Wisconsin, very important to the Native nations up there, and it is at risk both from climate change and from the oil pipelines that go through that area. So the proposal is to develop long-term solutions for proper management and protections for northern wild rice, lakes, rivers, and surrounding ecosystems. And they're proposing a group that would work on this, for which a minimum of half the membership should be determined by the Native nations in that area. The next recommendation is to create a statewide subsistence adaption plan, identifying species of importance for subsistence and evaluating, assessing the natural resources that subsistence communities rely upon. And again, this is something where I thought of this one in Gary's presentation, where he was talking about the risks to cold water fish. And the report talks about how walleye populations in northern Wisconsin are at risk. And I was thinking, well, there could be agroforestry solutions to that. Okay, now we move into some of the forestry related recommendations. They say prioritize forest conservation to keep forests as forests. So it has to do with how forest land is taxed, providing tax credits to landowners who donate conservation easements, investigating development of family forest carbon credit program, and providing additional funding for conservation easements and for purchasing lands to maintain them as working forests. They're talking that there's a recommendation to pursue reforestation in rural areas with tree planting campaigns, assisting private landowners to encourage more tree planting, prioritizing afforestation efforts on public lands, and creating the first state forest with a primary goal of carbon storage. Similarly, there's a recommendation to encourage tree planting in urban areas. There's a recommendation to implement climate-focused forest management. And this involves defining carbon as a forest product. So, and then there would be climate-focused management practices, including financial incentives for landowners to encourage underplanting in forests that are not fully stocked, to use carbon as a forest product, to facilitate incorporation of climate-focused management goals and practices. And I must admit, I don't really understand what this means. Funding to acquire conservation easements, and developing a family forest carbon program to allow small forest owners to access forest carbon markets. And then finally, supporting Wisconsin wood product utilization. Having local wood is good campaign, analyze the impact of various forestry-based strategies to store carbon, develop innovative wood-based technologies to store carbon, and support and incentivize the use of renewable thermal energy or woody biomass for heating. So those are the recommendations. And going back to 350 Madison, we're looking now to say, okay, there are lots of recommendations out there. Which are the most important? Which have the best possibility of being approved by our legislature? And how could we as an organization help ensure that these strategies are implemented? So I'd like to invite you, we have a monthly public meeting, and it will be on February 1st via Zoom. And the director of the Wisconsin Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy, who is the chief staff person on this project, will be speaking, and she'll give an overview of the report, and she will offer guidance on how we can help ensure that the task force strategies are implemented. So if you're from Wisconsin, or even if you aren't, if you're interested in this, you're very welcome to attend this meeting. And here's some links. If you want to register for the meeting, there's the link. And if you'd like to get involved in some other way, we are forming a group of people who will be focusing on a few of the 54 recommendations from this report and really working intensively to get these passed by the legislature. So if you'd like to get involved, you could feel free to contact me. Or if you'd like to be involved in some other way in our group, we also have that final link is to a volunteer survey where you could indicate your interest, and our volunteer coordinator will get in touch with you. So with that, I apologize about the problem with the screen sharing at the beginning, and thank you.
Thank you, Gail. And at this point, we have invited Gail and Gary to exchange questions to get the conversation started. And I've been noting the questions that are coming in the chat. So if there's a lull in the conversation at some point, I'll I'll jump in with some of those.
Well, Gail, I'd like to thank you for an excellent presentation. And I took a look at the climate report a little earlier and was really impressed with it and envious. Here in Nebraska, the University of Nebraska has kind of prepared some climate strategies and things of that nature. But when we move up to the state level, we hit a major roadblock in last year's legislature. There was a few that tried to allocate some funding and effort toward developing a plan, but unfortunately that got shot down. So I really think the strategies you outline really look, just good on first glance. And, I guess I'm one who always feels that if you talked about, should you focus on some and realize, sometimes a group has to kind of coalesce around a couple that they think they can really move forward. But I'm also of the mindset that we need as many tools in the toolbox as possible. I mean, this challenge we have before us is so extensive that I don't think, I think the more efforts we can bring to bear, the better. So I'll just stop with that particular comment. In terms of a question maybe for you is thinking, how would, say, an organization or an agency like the National Agroforestry Center might be able to support or assist an organization like 350 Madison? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think support from an organization like yours would be really welcome. A lot of what we do is to try to educate and empower people to speak up about climate change, because we believe that change won't really happen until people speak up and make it happen. And one way to do that is to provide them with good authoritative information, and also to make it clear that, hey, these are things that can be done, that are being done, that are practical and really beneficial. And I think some of the examples that you showed in your talk would be perfect things to say, not only is this not difficult or expensive, but it's very helpful. Your cows will grow faster if they have shade. It's so I think to bring, the ability that a group like yours would have to take science and translate it into practical examples is exactly the kind of thing that you can then use to communicate with our community. And I guess my question for you was kind of related to your question to me. It was, what do you see as the most effective way to apply the findings and recommendations from your agroforestry research to get them implemented on a large scale? What is the best way to do that?
I think that's a great question. Whoops. Okay, wasn't sure if I was still on mute. I think that's a great question. And again, a little bit more kind of like my previous answer, I think it's both a bottom up and tops down approach. So what I really like about seeing a group like Madison and other 350 organizations, they work either at often at a state level. And I think that's a nice way to start to get, like with this climate change plan, I think it's really nice. It's addressing all those cross-sectoral issues. And so just kind of having, when those reports are being presented and whatnot, talking about the different tools and resources that are out there, that can help accomplish those different strategies.
Mhm.
And thinking back to your comment on that, where we meet resistance, unfortunately, sometimes is people who think, addressing climate change is always going to be about cost. And it's like, no, we can do things better in a more, honestly, economically healthier way, and trying to demonstrate those ways through at that state level and whatnot, showing these kind of tools like agroforestry, and agroforestry is just one that can help achieve it. In particular, like Wisconsin, with its grazing, grazed landscape, that livestock well-being and heat issues are going to be something that's going to be increasing, and that this is one way to kind of help manage that and help actually producers still maintain their bottom line.
Right. And I think that's extremely important. Like in Wisconsin, we have a Democratic governor who's concerned and interested in addressing climate change, but we also have a very conservative legislature where there's a lot of climate change deniers and a lot of resistance. And the way we're most likely to succeed in terms of getting needed legislative action is to be able to present things, to say these are win-win. This will help the productivity of your farm. You won't be sacrificing, you'll actually be ahead economically. And I think there are a lot of things where that is the case.
One of the things I really appreciate about an organization like yours is you're able to do things that we can't. Anything that's kind of policy, even if it's a policy that's shared by the administration, as a federal employee, I can't even hardly use the word policy. And that's just regardless of who's in the House. It's just, as federal employees, we don't set policy. We just carry out, and in my role, more kind of provide that science and that the scientific based tools. So it's great to see organizations like yourself really working at that policy level and looking broadly to make sure these solutions are cross-sectoral. So kudos to you and your organization.
I'd like to jump in here because I think the policy piece is a really important one, and sort of a connecting piece for both of you in the work that you do. And with the National Agroforestry Center, it does seem like, even though you're not an advocacy organization and can't be in that role, there are ways that you can communicate to government officials and, share this information in order to have an influence on policy. Is that something that folks at the National Agroforestry Center have been doing at all?
I mean, I think so. We always are trying to get that science and that evidence out there to and really trying to avoid preaching to the choir that already doesn't need convincing. So through, our different outreach materials, presentations and whatnot, we do try to do that. But as you kind of know, our particular center is pretty small. And we're envious of your center and Savannah. You guys are the heavyweights in some ways. But I think together, that provides a way that collaboratively, I think we can get that message out much better. So I'm really excited just to see, again, Center for Agroforestry, Savannah Institute, the 350 groups, we've got a lot more energy and possibilities through that broader network.
Yeah. I am really sorry, my Zoom has frozen up. So I think I missed what you were saying.
I don't know, Hannah, if you want to summarize your question
Sure.
or your point.
Well, yeah, we were just talking about the ways that we can each influence policy in our own realms, and even the National Agroforestry Center in some ways, you know, having the science and the information to back up groups like yours.
Uh-huh. And I think that's a good partnership. Because you could help us communicate accurate and compelling information and good examples and good stories of successes. And then we could do, for example, there was a public hearing in front of our Department of Natural Resources this summer where we were able to turn out 500 people to submit testimony. So that's kind of the role we could play.
Yeah. Well, we have a couple of questions from the attendees here, if we're ready for a little bit of a gear shift. One person asked, don't pipelines take tens of thousands of tanker trucks off the road, which would be both safer and lower a carbon footprint? Can you speak to that, Gail?
Our position is that we should not be investing in fossil fuel infrastructure, that we need to transition rapidly to renewable energy, and that continuing to exploit oil reserves has to stop. If you build a new pipeline, you have a investment that will commit you to continue to drill for the oil so you could fill the pipeline for the next 30 or more years. And we just do not have that luxury given what's happening with climate change.
Yeah, and I think just, coming back to the ways that we're collaborating here, thinking about how we can care for the land in many ways. So certainly that's an important point, Gail. And then this is a question for Gary, and there are a couple here related to planting trees. So one is whether we should, since temperatures are getting warmer and many trees take decades to mature, should we plant trees now that are a zone or two higher than our current zone? What do you suggest for that?
Oh, that's a great question, and one we're wrestling with ourselves in terms of recommendations and what does the kind of evidence suggest and so forth. And I think in general, it's a good thing to think about. Zones are usually based off of cold hardiness. And if you look at the USDA hardiness zone map, the things over the last 20 years, Arbor Day has made a new one and it has shown the shift upward. And so I think trying to look at how one's climate is going to be different in your area and kind of looking for plant material that now grow in an area with similar climate right now is a tool to do that. There's a tool out there where you can pick your city and it will provide, say for 2060 and 2080, I believe, what other city your climate will be like. It's kind of a neat resource. And that can give you an idea in terms of kind of heat and precipitation changes. That said, I've also talked with people out in the Pacific Northwest where they've tried to put in plant material that they think will be good 100 years from now, and it's not able to make it right now because it's too much of a leap for that plant material in terms of conditions. So looking at that, there's also US Forest Service has another tool. It's for Eastern plant materials or Eastern trees. And it's with some climate modeling, looking at where natural regeneration of trees will shift over time. With agroforestry, we tend to plant materials in places. So it's not quite the same, but that tool, which I can drop in the chat in a little bit, could provide some insight. But long story short, short story long, it would be worthwhile to consider how you're climate shifting and what trees and shrubs and other plant materials will be suitable down the road.
So related to that, Gary, someone else asked, what do you think is the best method to convince farmers to plant trees that take 20 years or, you know, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, to see the benefits and the returns?
Another great question, and a corollary to that challenge is that so much of our agricultural land is leased. So how do you, as Savannah and Hannah knows that the challenges with leased lands, where you want to try to get these long-lived trees out, and the lease may just be year to year or, you know, a couple years. And so, you know, one of the things I think about is trying to tie back if the family or the owner has cultural identity with the property and wants to leave a legacy, might be one avenue. That can speak to some people who want to leave something for the next generation. There's also opportunities with things that, depending on what the goal and objectives are, there are faster growing species, depending on what you want to accomplish, that might actually be in a shorter time frame than, you know, a black walnut for lumber, or you know, or other trees for nut crops. So that's another way that might provide a foot in the door.
I'll just drop a little bit of a plug here. The Agroforestry podcast will be starting season 2 this month. And our first episode is on land access. So we'll be talking about a lot of those issues: long-term leases, land trusts, you know, land turnover. So you can look forward to that. Sign up for subscribe to the Agroforestry podcast if you're not already. So we've got a couple of questions here about hemp. So this question is for Gary. With hemp being legalized and potentially federally legalized now, do you know of financial and climate opportunities for hemp to contribute to climate resilience?
I'll have to be honest, I have not really delved into that arena, just through work. So it would be very, I could make erroneous statements. So I'm going to just pass on that one since I haven't kept up.
Sure. There are some other agricultural organizations that have some information about hemp. So I'll drop some links in the chat for that. And a related question for Gail was about what might be keeping hemp from being legalized federally. I don't know if you have thoughts, Gail.
I'm afraid I don't. I'm not knowledgeable about the arguments on both sides of that.
That's fine. Straying a little bit from the climate change conversation, but wanted to make sure the question was asked. And we also had someone who said, you know, I think the carbon credit idea, carbon as a product, could be so effective, but getting that passed seems tough or too administratively intensive. So I don't know if you all have thoughts on that. Carbon credits.
Carbon credit. Yeah, there's basically most economists will say that having a price on carbon is ultimately going to be extremely important if we're going to address climate change. And there's a bill at the federal level that would establish a federal carbon tax, just in general, not just for agricultural type products, but for everything. It's not really going anywhere. I think there's a lot of resistance to the idea of a tax. This whole idea, though, of a market-based approach to carbon reduction, I think should have a lot of potential. And I think the challenge is going to be to get people to accept it. It's harder to understand, I think, and a little bit more threatening than some other approaches that are being talked about. So.
Yeah, I think I'll add that I think, as you'll get, it's a redundant name. It's one tool, and I think, you know, we shouldn't discard it. We should consider it, and I think along that lines, looking at, you know, these carbon-based solutions, kind of maybe valuing them based on how permanent they are. I think some of the markets for carbon sequestration, the method of sequestering carbon can be maybe a little more ephemeral in looking at maybe a sliding scale where if it really locks carbon away for, you know, a longer period of time, 100+ years or more, that would be essentially rewarded more than something that could essentially be lost if somebody decides to go back to moldboard plowing. So, you know, valuing that ephemeral and temporal aspect.
Well, we just have a couple minutes left. I do want to just ask one more question for both of you to sort of bring this all together about what you think. And I think Gail, you asked a similar question in your presentation, but what do you think would be the most impactful measures or activities for us to take at this point? And what do we know about that? You know, what do we know about the science of what practices, for instance, as even agroforestry, within agroforestry practices, have the most impact on reducing the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, well, that's actually the question that I posed to this group, because this is not an area where I personally have expertise. And one of my, even though I think that the report that came out with 54 recommendations was a really good report, one of my criticisms is that they're all just kind of out there. And it would sure be nice to know, you know, where you're going to get the most impact for your expenditure of money and effort. And that would be my response. I don't know, but I think it's a really important question.
Yeah, I think when looking at solutions, I'm not going to say there's one agroforestry practice that's probably better for the climate than others, partly because, you know, when you look at it regionally, I think some practices make more sense in some areas than other practices. But, you know, I think it still gets to looking at what solutions can provide the most benefits. I think we're going to have a really hard sell for solutions that are just, oh, we're going to need to do it to just sequester carbon. What else are we getting out of that solution? Is it providing food? Is it providing another ecosystem service? Is it helping restore biodiversity? You know, those broader based solutions that can provide multiple benefits. One, I think that's going to resonate with a broader audience. You know, some of those people that maybe aren't quite so accepting that we need action, they might at least buy into, okay, I understand food security. So you say it also provides climate benefits. Maybe that's not such an important issue for me, but I'll go for it because it's going to meet my other concerns.
Wonderful points. Yeah. Well, we are at 7:01 on my clock. So unless there are any final comments to add, I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight, especially Gail Nordheim and Gary Bentrup. Thank you both so much for sharing your perspective and engaging in this dialogue with us. And just for everyone out there, but this recorded video will be available on both the Mizzou Agroforestry YouTube channel and the Savannah Institute YouTube channel. So if you missed it for some reason, you'll be able to see that there. So thanks everyone so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fun.